Loading hot takes in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back into TwinTakes Fantasy Football, now with fixed mic and mic stand. Yeah, I noticed some audio inconsistencies in the first couple episodes. That's probably due to me holding the microphone with my hand and moving it around. So went to Amazon, bought this beautiful $15 mic stand, and the production value of the show has skyrocketed. With that being taken care of, let's keep the same energy rolling from the last episode where we talked about league-winning wide receivers and talk about league-winning running backs. I think this year is going to be a very interesting year. Last year and in years previous, most of the years I've been doing fantasy, there was always this incredible crop of running backs at the top of every draft, and people would say, well, you always draft a running back in the first round. We would see on average 8, 9 running backs being drafted in the first round. I think that drastically changes this year. I think this year we will see the lowest average number of running backs taken in the first round. And that's because there's a lot of age at the top of the running back class this year. Austin Eckler's getting up in age and considering retirement. Derrick Henry is getting up in age and had major injury last year. And Joe Mixon's also getting up there in age. And those are 3 guys that I'm staying away from just based on that and some of the surrounding circumstances alone. Based on who I think should go in the first round for running backs, there's 4 guys. Jonathan Taylor, obviously. CMC, despite injury concerns, still place him up there. Dalvin Cook, he's my 3rd running back this year. I think he's going to regress back towards the mean, get a lot more touchdowns, be heavily involved in this Kevin O'Connell offense. I think he's going to be a smash pick, and I'm taking him higher than most people currently have him slotted at his ADP. And finally, the last running back in the first round is my number 1 guy on this list, DAndre Swift. Now, DAndre Swift, if you're drafting in late July, early August, you could probably get him in the early to middle second rounds, and I was super happy with that. I could pair a number 1 wide receiver with DAndre Swift at the turn, or depending on where you are in the draft. Unfortunately, his ADP has risen, so I can no longer do that, but I must say I am happy that people are starting to come around to his talent and recognizing what a great football player this kid is. He's still very young, and as you probably discern from my intro to this show, I have a heavy bias against older running backs and consequently a heavy bias towards young running backs. DAndre Swift is still 23 years old and in the prime of his running back life. He has an unbelievable talent at running back and has shown it in his 2 years in the NFL. His rookie season, he had these kind of sporadic games and these moments of genius, but didn't put it all together. Last year, he really did put it all together up until that Thanksgiving week injury against the Bears where he injured his shoulder and was out for quite a few games. Up until that point, he was a top 7 running back. And speaking of that injury, I think that's why his ADP is so quote-unquote low at this current point. That injury soured a ton of fantasy managers on DAndre Swift. He missed a crucial part of the season leading up to fantasy championships, and then in the semifinal round of most people's fantasy leagues, he came back. Dan Campbell said he's going to give him a normal workload, going to utilize DAndre Swift like he normally would, 100%, and that just didn't happen. I think Swift got like 3 to 4 touches in the entire game, walked away with like 2 points. A lot of the touches out of the backfield went to Amon-Ra St. Brown, of all people, which is ludicrous. And he was really a massive red herring for a lot of people, including myself, and submarined their chances at a fantasy championship. So I think that whole sequence of events has dropped his ADP, and then something that you can take advantage of if you're sitting there at the end of the first round. Also, while DAndre Swift is not the best runner in the NFL, not by a long shot, he might be one of the best pass-catching backs. And as we know, running backs that catch passes are a cheat code in fantasy. Jared Goff has maybe the worst arm talent in the entire NFL. He loves his checkdowns, loves his dump-off passes, and this just means tons of opportunity for DAndre Swift. He could be slated for 70 to 80 receptions based on my projections this year, and I think that aspect of his game is going to make him insanely valuable. And also, there's just very little competition for targets in Detroit. I mean, their highest skill position player that they drafted is Jameson Williams, who won't be around for at least 8 to 10 games. So are you worried about DJ Chark? He's shown that he can be productive with Jamal Williams also taking snaps in the backfield. Maybe Amon-Ra St. Brown is the only other like dangerous wide receiver to take away targets, but there's very little competition, and you know that DAndre Swift will consistently get 15 to 20 touches every single game just based on who they have there running out of that backfield. And here's my hot take. He is my dark horse for running back 1 this year. I'm that high on DAndre Swift. Moving on to my second league-winning running back is a running back that's actually 2 years older than DAndre Swift, but has much less tread on the tires, and that's Najee Harris. Obviously, we know how valuable Steelers running backs are for fantasy historically. Mike Tomlin is a big fan of the one bell cow running back. And even if he wasn't, even if Tomlin had some massive revelation where he's like, I need more running backs to shoulder the load, what other running back in this room really scares you to actually take away touches from Najee Harris? Benny Snell, yeah, that's a name that does not strike fear in me. The same as DAndre Swift, Najee has tremendous patch guessing ability, but he is also a tremendous runner of the football. He's actually a better power runner when it comes to pure running ability. I would put him up there with Nick Chubb as one of the best runners in the NFL. Secondly, the opportunity is just going to be given. Most people don't realize that Najee Harris had more opportunities last year than Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor had 381 opportunities and Najee Harris had 387. So it's not much more, but he had the most opportunities of any fantasy asset in the entire league. The opportunity is there. Even if they do reduce that by 20%, I'm still taking over 300 touches for Najee, and I think he can do a lot with them out of that backfield. And people I've talked about, especially my landmines video about quarterbacks who take the offensive down, and obviously Mitch Trubisky nor Kenny Pickett have really inspired any confidence in anyone this preseason. However, running backs are excellent security blankets for rookie QBs. Rookie QBs tend to hold onto the ball for a lot longer, and they end up panicking and dumping off the ball. Najee Harris has some of the surest hands in the NFL. He will definitely be a security blanket for Kenny Pickett. So if Kenny Pickett does earn the starting job, my confidence is still as strong, putting Najee Harris out there each and every week. Also, so what if Kenny Pickett doesn't earn the job? It's Mitch Trubisky. Mitch Trubisky made David Montgomery a top 10 running back with his ability to check down to the running back and allow them a huge pass catching opportunity. So basically, what I'm saying is I'm taking that fantasy run that David Montgomery took a lot of people to the championship back in 2020. I'm just applying it to Najee Harris here, and I think that projects really well for him. I think Najee is the absolute safest running back in the entire draft this year. So moving on to my third fantasy winning running back, and that's Travis Etienne. And I think I'm really kind of iffy on the fantasy running back dead zone this year, but there are two running backs that I really like in that area, and the first one is Travis Etienne. First off, the team believes in him. He has first-round draft capital for an RB, which is really hard to come by in today's NFL, and it just shows you what kind of talent that Travis Etienne is. James Robinson, even though there's reports at a camp that he's back to normal, that he's still dealing with, that he'll be ready for week 1, he's still dealing with an Achilles injury. And not to make a pun here, but Achilles is the Achilles heel of running backs. The reason why Cam Akers just was so insane last year was no one had ever seen that quick of a turnaround from Achilles injury by a running back. And even the running backs that do make it back to the playing field after tearing their Achilles, it was 1 to 2 years before they're actually remotely productive. And this is preseason, guys. We don't know how James Robinson is going to react in an actual game-like setting, and we don't know if he still has the same burst and the same speed pre-Achilles tear. And at the very, very minimum, he just won't be his normal self for at least 8 to 10 games, which means Travis Etienne has very little competition for touches in that backfield as far as the other running backs go. And they're really going to lead on Travis Etienne to be the running back 1, as James Robinson is. I'm still just really, really iffy on that injury, despite all the positive reports coming out of camp. Speaking of no competition for touches, is there a single tight end or wide receiver that really strikes you as a massive fantasy asset down there in Jacksonville? Christian Kirk is your wide receiver 1. He hasn't really done too much in Arizona with Kyler Murray, who was a fantasy darling for the past few years. Evan Ingram, okay, Mr. Drops everything. None of those guys, I think, are really going to command a lot of targets, and ultimately will not be any sort of tight end 1 or well, Evan Ingram, actually a little high on Evan Ingram, but Christian Kirk, I know there's a lot of hype around him. People are calling him a sleeper. I just don't think he's going to really materialize into the fantasy talent people think he is. So when it comes to pass catching, even as a wide receiver, if they line up Etienne in the slot, I think he might even be the best pass catcher on that roster. So I think just the lack of other talent at the core skill position players makes Etienne a opportunity monster this year. And speaking of pass catching, Trevor Lawrence. Why is no one talking about the college connection that Etienne and Lawrence have? Etienne was arguably the running back one, and Lawrence was arguably, well, not arguably, he was the quarterback one coming out of his class. And they obviously both helped each other. Everyone's making such a huge hype and drama over, Davante Adams reuniting with Derek Carr. It's going to be this insane connection. Okay. We talked about this in league-winning wide receivers with Hollywood reuniting with Kyler Murray. Let's talk about Etienne finally getting to play with his college quarterback. And obviously, it's more recent than either of those two examples I just posted. And they had tremendous production in college no less than 2 years ago. So I'm pretty hyped on that college connection. And I think Etienne and Lawrence are going to pick up where they left off at Clemson. And finally, two great things happened for the Jaguars this past year. First, they fired Urban Meyer. Secondly, they hired Doug Peterson, and I think that's going to spell wonders for the running game in Jacksonville, because if we look back to Doug Peterson's history with the Eagles, he had really involved a lot of the running backs and schemed for them, not only in very creative running plays and jet sweeps to get them open, but also in a lot of pass catching scenarios, utilizing them downfield. So I think he's going to scheme a lot of opportunity for Travis Etienne just based on how he likes to utilize his running backs. And even if on the off chance, like I said, I'm still worried about James Robinson, but even if James Robinson is the one aberration and just comes out and is just spectacular despite the Achilles, the way that Doug Peterson loves to use running backs, there is plenty of room for both of these players to be fantasy relevant on this team. So moving to the fourth fantasy running back to win you your league this year, and that's Aaron Jones. And wow, I cannot believe this guy is an end of the second round running back. I think his ADP has ticked up a little bit in recent weeks to more the middle of the second round, but I remember doing some underdog drafts in July, and you could get him in the third round. It was insane. But Green Bay has lost 3 wide receivers, including Davante Adams. That's like over 250 vacated targets, and historically, vacated targets go to the running backs. Aaron Jones. And Rodgers only really involves, it's been a stickler for fantasy this past few years about how Rodgers is kind of a weirdo and he only throws and involves players that he trusts. Do you really think he's going to trust rookies? I know there's a ton of hype coming out about Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson, but they're rookies. They haven't really had that connection with Rodgers yet. And out of every skill position player, apart from maybe an old and beat up Randall Cobb, who probably needs a walker to get around the practice facility up there at Lambeau, Aaron Jones might have the most trust of anyone there for Rodgers. And he's one of the best pass-catching running backs in the NFL, period. Even better than DAndre Swift, and it hurts my soul to say that, I promise you, because I'm really high on DAndre Swift. But we've seen his pass-catching ability on display, and he is S tier, number one, unparalleled when it comes to that. And listen, vacated targets in the pass game, historically going to the running back, and a running back that has tremendous pass catching ability, please and thank you. I'll take Aaron Jones all day, every day with that. Fourthly, it's a fairly easy conference in the NFC North. I mean, the Bears, the Lions. We all can basically pencil in Green Bay Packers to win the division for the umpteenth year in a row. And once the Green Bay Packers get up on players, they're just going to rely on A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones to kind of go down the field and eat clock, and it's going to provide a lot of opportunity in both the run game and pass game for Aaron Jones. And finally, I'm not worried about Dillon. People are saying, Dillon's a sleeper running back. I'm super high on him. He's going to take over the backfield this year. Even with Dillon, we saw last year that Aaron Jones can provide a ton of production with Dillon on the field, and it's even come out that Matt LaFleur said they're going to use Aaron Jones as a slot wide receiver. They're going to put him in the slot. They're going to line him up in receiving routes. So I don't care if Dillon gets over 50% of the touches or over half the touches from the running back slot. They're still going to use Aaron Jones as a wide receiver. They're still going to utilize him, I think, the most of any weapon in that entire skill position player room up in Lambeau. So between the receiving threat and the running back opportunity of Aaron Jones, I think he's a smash play. He's another one of those guys that I'm just loving pairing an early round wide receiver in the first, and then Aaron Jones coming back in the second, and super comfortable with him as my number one running back. And then finally, We're going to go back to the RB dead zone, and I'm staying away from everyone except Travis Etienne and this guy, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Okay. Stop all the boos. Come back to me for a second. Same thing as Aaron Jones. Lost 3 wide receivers, including Hill, and I don't need to repeat this anymore. Vacated targets. Go to the running backs. For all Clyde's faults and the fact that he's undersized and not a great power runner, he is an excellent pass catcher, and that is the sole reason why Patrick Mahomes vouched for him and for the Chiefs to draft him when he came out of LSU. Also, I know this is hard to justify with stats, but I'm always in on the post hype sleeper. You got to wait 2 years after the hype. You got to wait for 2 down years, then you take the player. That's why I took Joe Mixon at the 2-3 turn last year, and he ended up smashing for fantasy, and his ADP is now back to the first round. So it's been Clyde Edwards-Helaire had a down rookie year, had a down last year. Post hype sleeper. I'm in on Clyde this year. And also another reason for that is Andy Reid has been proven that he will scheme for his running backs. If we go back to Clyde's rookie year in the opening game against the Texans, Reid knew it was important for Clyde to get a touchdown. He schemed 6 red zone touches at the goal line for Clyde to get a touchdown, and obviously Clyde didn't put any of them in because he's not a very powerful back and undersized. So in that case, Andy Reid schemed a screen pass for Clyde so he could run in a touchdown from about 14 to 15 yards out. Reid will scheme for his players. The opportunity will be there. It won't be, we're going to hand it to him out of the backfield and see what he does. He will create opportunities for Clyde to be successful. And honestly, I just think there's too much hype on the incoming free agents and Sky Moore as a rookie, and it's really pushed Clyde's value down, making him one of the most valuable running backs in the RB dead zone. My hot take for the Chiefs is that not a single wide receiver will have over 600 yards receiving this year. I think, and this is still with Patrick Mahomes throwing over 4,000 yards. Travis Kelce will get 1,100 yards. Blake Bell is a fantastic tight end. He looked amazing last year, and I think he'll have 600 yards. You can pencil in Juju, Sky Moore, MVS, Mecole Hardman, pencil them all in for 500 to 600 yards, and then another 1,000 yards is going to go to Jerick McKinnon, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and definitely not Ronald Jones because he can't catch a pass. But I think they're going to utilize running backs as pass-catching weapons instead of leaning on these guys who are unfamiliar with the Chiefs' playbook. So those are all the running backs that I think that you should be targeting in your drafts, that I would draft higher than the consensus, and the ones that I think will lead people to fantasy championships this year.